Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 5th of August of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First we're going to start with the Black Sea. I'll remind you that this morning the Ukrainians made another Navy attack with the usage of the Navy drone, and as a result of that attack the Ukrainians managed to damage the civilian ship, and of course that completely changed the entire situation in the Black Sea. The Ukrainians, it was the second attack of Ukrainian drones in a row, and basically the Ukrainians confirmed that they're the side who controls the Black Sea and they can attack every single ship in this area. And right after that successful attack against the civilian ship, but according to some sources that wasn't just a regular civilian ship, the Russian Ministry of Defense were using that ship for supporting and supplying their forces in Syria. The Ukrainians announced their blockade, or at least they call it like military danger situation in the Russian ports. So basically on this map, on this video, you're gonna see on the screen like the ports that Ukrainians, let's call it blocked, and call the situation is critical from the military perspective. This is the settlement, this is the ports in Sochi. This is the first one. The second one is Tuapse. The third port is Gelendzhik. The next one is Novorossiysk, the area where the Ukrainians yesterday made another Navy drone attack and damaged the Russian ship, and another one is Anapa, and the last one is in the vicinity of Tamань. This is also very important, probably the most important port, because of oil refinery and place where the Russians can pack the oil carriers or oil ships or something like this. So the situation is very critical for the Russians. They need to show the world wide that they are able to control the situation, because currently we can't say that the Russians is the side who controls the situation in the Black Sea. Furthermore, today there was another episode with the Global Hawk. Today the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the United States Global Hawk was flying above the territory of the Black Sea, and at some point of time started movements and moving in direction of Crimea. So and the Minister of Defense reported that they managed to get very close to that area. The Russians raised their Su-30 in this area and started like counterattacking the United States Global Hawk. But when the United States of America, the intelligence discovered the Russian Su-30, the Global Hawk turned its direction and started flying back in direction of the mainland. After that, the Russians reported they discovered another drone in the vicinity of Crimea that was destroyed by the Russian forces. So the situation is critical. The battle of Black Sea is intensifying, and for now I can't tell you for sure who is winning. Anyway, as I understand, the Russians will win the war of the Battle of Black Sea because they have possibilities, they have resources, they don't have problems with supplying support, they don't have technologies. The only thing that the Russians have problem with is time, because the Battle of the Black Sea needed to be won today, not in 6 months. But basically this war is going to be won in 6 months, and those were not the last ships that were damaged by the Ukrainian forces. There are going to be more and more ships. As a result of, as an act of revenge, the Russians launched a massive missile attack all over the entire Ukraine. The sources were saying that there were explosions in Zaporozhye, in the Ukrainian industrial zones. There were explosions in Starokonstantinov. This is the area and the settlement of Ukrainian air defense base, and we discussed the 7th Aviation Brigade, and this is the brigade who has the weapon on board, which has not just weapon like that's planes Su-24 that are able to attack using the Storm Shadow missiles. But this is not the main main issue. There are also more issues I will explain to you. First of all, also the Russians published the video of the Kinzhal strike. So this is, according to the author of this video, this is the fly of Kinzhal missile. So I can't tell you confirm or not confirm this piece of information, just the fact that according to some Russian sources took place. But this is not the only big problem. Probably the biggest problem of that provocation in the Black Sea and the Russian acts of revenge is that probably since the beginning of the autumn, or probably even summer of the previous year, the strikes with Kinzhals were made from the territory of Belarus, and this is the most terrible and critical situation. Because if you remember, probably as a result of some negotiation process, as a result of some agreements, the Russians stopped attacking the territory came from the territory of Belarus, and it was probably part of agreements, and now the Russians restarted their attacks. And of course, it's completely two different situation when you attack the territory of Ukraine, let's say the western part, let's say from somewhere from Tambov. It will take a lot of time, even with Kinzhals, to get these positions against the western part of Ukraine, and Ukrainians will have time to make redeployment, to raise their flights in the sky, to redeploy their helicopters, and many other things. So distance mean times, but when you attack from the territory of Belarus, the time reduced on the minimal level. So one more time, the territory of Belarus was involved in the special military operation, and this is a very big problem for everybody, because it's a very big problem anyway. Now we're moving further to the ground, and we're going to start discussion. And first we're going to start with the Ministry of Defense report regarding Novoselovsk. Today the Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings, as a result of storming operation that took place, that been taking place since the beginning of this probably but maybe the last few months, the Russians were trying to storm that settlement. First we got report about the taking control over the railway station, then the Russians crossed the railways and started storming and pushing the Ukrainians inside of the settlement. As you can see, this settlement was reduced to ruins as a result of clashes during the previous days, and today the Russians captured that settlement completely. This is a very difficult situation, a very interesting situation, because if you remember, the Ryber, the military Russian blogger, reported that this settlement was have been already taken few months ago, but as I understand, that was a small speculation, or at least not the complete information. In this video we see the Ukrainian forces who were trying to evacuate, escape, were trying to hide themselves between the armored vehicles, but anyway the Russians captured that settlement. So most of the attacks took place, of course, from the Kuzyumovka. The Russians were trying to attack in the western direction, and to support the Russian forces, the Russian in that operation, the Russians were attacking and bombing Stelimakhovka using the flamethrower system. So because the main forces and the main reinforcements that Ukrainians had were located in Stelimakhovka and Berestova. We haven't received any videos from Berestova of Russian suppressing of their reserves, but we got the video of bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions in Stelimakhovka. So the settlement was taken. This settlement doesn't have any value when talking just about this settlement, but this settlement, Novoselovskaya, have a very big value when talking about other two operations in this area. The first one is Operation Karmazinovka Bridgehead, and the second one, the operation in the vicinity of Sinkovka, Alshany, Petropavlovka. Minister of Defense of Russian Federation also reported that the Russians managed to advance further using the broad front line attack on the line between Alshany, Sinkovka, Petropavlovka. They managed to develop their bridgehead, managed to capture more reliable positions, and they're pushing to the main road N26, trying to cut the Ukrainian forces in two parts. I'll remind you that Ukrainians have accumulated significant number of forces in this area, but yet no matter the forces, the Ukrainians are stepping back in these directions. Also, the Russians added that as a result of fierce clashes exactly on the Kupyansk front line, the Ukrainians lost 140 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles, and 3 artillery systems. Furthermore, today the Russians published very interesting video from Novoyegorovka, and this is the video, and this video confirms the control of Ukrainian forces at least over this part of the front line. So this is basically the second geolocated video from this region. Yesterday we discussed how the Ukrainians were trying to counterattack the Russian positions in the vicinity of that forest. I'll remind you that video one more time. So this is the video that was the attempt of Ukrainian forces to counterattack the Russian positions. If you remember, the Ukrainians almost got this forest, but then they were counterattacked by the Russian artillery systems. The Ukrainians lost few armored vehicles and were destroyed. So basically this salient is under Ukrainian control. And as you can see, according to that video that we discussed just a second ago about Novoyegorovka, the Russians currently are doing some kind of artillery preparation against the city. The main problem of this bridgehead for the Ukrainian side is that they didn't expect that the Russians would cross Zhiribets river and would attack attack the Ukrainians in this direction. So basically, the level of strongholds and fortifications in this area are on the very low level. The Ukrainians haven't prepared themselves for very big and, let's say, intense, very big clashes and fightings in this area. So the Russians used this situation. They started counter-artillery duels, artillery preparation. And after probably a day or within the next 24 hours, the Russians will start offensive operation inside of this Novogorovka. Why the Russians are going to attack there is also, we can move back to the geolocated video about Ukraine counter-offensive operation. The Ukrainians on this bridgehead have at least 3 main fortifications, and most of the fortifications are located inside of the forest on this area. So these are 3 fortifications, and basically I'm not sure that the Russians, they can capture these fortifications, but I don't think that the Russians will try to risk, because of while storming these fortifications, of course the Russians will have a lot of losses. But if the Russians can capture Novoyegorovka, with is large fortified, there is like the settlements under the open sky, the Russians will be able to proceed their offensive operation further to the south, and basically they will be able to encircle the Ukrainian forces in those 3 forest lines. And I'll remind you that when talking about this area, the Ukrainians mainly use the forces of 103rd Territorial Defense Brigade, of 1st Presidential Brigade Burevye, and of course the forces of 25th Airborne Brigade. So situation for the Ukrainians in this is very critical, and the Russians, after storming Novoyegorovka, will try to encircle the Ukrainian forces in those forests and those forest lines. So this is the situation about this bridgehead. When talking one more time about Novosilovka, currently after the fall of that settlement, the Russians will try to reduce the Ukrainian positions along Zhiribets River, and basically the Russians have access and have possibility to continue their offensive operation in direction of Berestova, which will try to implement, but I'm not sure that it's going to be front attack, like in front, in face of that settlement, because of minefields and so on. But I'm not sure that the minefields in this area have a very big level, like this area is very mined, because of that the Ukrainians in the past were using these roads between Berestova and Novosilovka as supply roads, and the Ukrainians were sending a lot of reserves, reinforcements to develop their own offensive operation in Kuzyomovka. So basically the Russians do have possibility to start movement from Novosilovka and Berestova, and if they have enough of manpower to attack and make a very fast attack. And they're gonna do this, and the main purpose is not to capture Berestova, but to pin down the Ukrainians, and the most important is to split the Ukrainian reserves, because currently the Russians are pushing from the north, and the Ukrainians need to use some reserves, and also the Russians will push in direction of Berestova, and the Ukrainians will use more reserves, and of course the Russians will attack in direction of Stelmakhovka, and the Ukrainians also will be forced to use some reserves. Maybe they're going to be the fourth wave of attack, probably the final, and the main, maybe all these waves of attacks is not the primary, just the secondary, who knows. But I'll remind you that the Russians managed to accumulate around 100,000 army on this direction. When talking about Liman front line, we also got a lot of updates from this bridgehead. The Russians, after a small operational pause in this area, started artillery preparation and artillery bombing of Ukrainian positions in the small settlement by the name of Tarskoye. On this video we see how the Russians were bombing and shelling this area, this bridgehead. As you can see, there is a Zhiribets river, and there is like a few kilometers from Russian positions to this river. The Russians start bombing the Ukrainian positions, and I expect that also within the next few hours the Russians will restart their offensive operation and also will split this Ukrainian territory in 2 parts. I'm not sure that the Russians are going to cross Zhiribets river, so basically I'm not sure that they're going to be clusters for Zarechina, for this settlement, but the Russians will clear Tarskoye, and will within the next maybe week or days will try to establish the combat line along this Zhiribets river. This blue line is basically Zhiribets river, so as you can see the distance between the river and possible Russian positions is very small. Let's calculate the distance. So there are just 1 kilometer, so it's nothing. I'm not even sure why the Russians haven't already implemented and made this small breakthrough. Maybe there are some fortifications from the Ukrainian side, maybe they just wanted to use some time because their positions are very close to each other, and basically they wanted to attack the Ukrainians while redeployment, while supply forces supporting, and so on. And now we are moving to the south, and we're going to talk about Belogorovka area. Today we got also another interesting video from Grigorievka. The Russians started bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions in that settlement as well, which means that the front line is moving and the front line is getting closer and closer to the Seversky Donetsk River. The Ukrainians were using this settlement for sending some reserves and reinforcements to the Kremenaya forest. The Kremenaya forest is not stable. Currently the situation develops not in Ukrainian favor. The Russians are pushing, so that's mine. That means that the combat line and positions are getting closer to the river, and the Russians currently, we can say, bombed the Ukrainian edge positions in the vicinity of Kremenaya forest and in this area as well. When talking about Donetsk front line, we haven't received much updates, just the regular clashes in this area. The Ukrainians haven't made like massive attempts to attack the Russian positions in Klishchiivka, and maybe we can have like a feeling that maybe the Ukrainians took a decision to change their tactics. Very difficult to understand whether the Ukrainians are going to restart their offensive operation or not. We understand that Ukrainians have a lot of problems on the Kupyansk front line, and we understand that Bakhmut and Artyomovsk is the closest positions for the Ukrainians in this bridgehead. So if the Ukrainians need to use some strategical reserves in the vicinity of Kupyansk and Liman, of course they will use the reserves from Bakhmut, from Artyomovsk, yes. And this is the reason maybe of this small operational pause, because the Ukrainians can't afford themselves to use two offensive operation, let's say on the Kupyansk front line, like counter-offensive operation, because they need to counter-attack, and in Artyomov's direction. If they use these two directions, there's a very high chances that they will be defeated, and on either on the Kupyansk and on Donetsk front line. So that's why they were forced to use a small operational pause to wait at the end of the Kupyansk, let's say, defensive operation, and after that they will restart their offensive operation in these directions. Today we got just a video how the Ukrainians made another attempt to attack in direction of Yagidne. This video is geolocated. This video shows how the Russians were tracking the Ukrainian movements from Khromovo, from the Domino, probably stronghold inside of Artyomovsk. The Ukrainians sent a convoy of a fist of armored vehicles and light vehicles in direction of Yagidne. The Russians managed to discover Ukrainian positions, and after that the Russians started bombing and shelling them, and as you can see, that attack was repelled by the Russians, and the Ukrainians lost almost 50% of their personnel and their attack fist during that attack, and the Ukrainians haven't managed to achieve nothing as a result of that offensive operation. But anyway, we see that Ukrainians still continue attacks. On this video we see the attacks against the group of Ukrainian soldiers, another bloody massacre operation, a suicide operation from the Ukrainian forces in this bridgehead. Also the Russians published videos how they continue bombing and shelling the Ukrainian positions inside of the Klishchiivka fortifications. This is the Ukrainians who are trying to relocate and redeploy themselves among the trenches. The Russians control the situation. The Ukrainians are not attacking massively, and currently they're using, like according to the Russian sources, attacks with the small waves. So with the platoons, with the 20 soldiers, they're attacking all over the front line without support of infantry or armored vehicles, without support of armored vehicles and tanks, just using the light infantry with munition, with machine guns, with grenades and so on. The Russians of course controls the situation. They can see this, and this is just another point of pressure. The Ukrainians can't launch a massive attack. The only thing they can do is to always to attack, to bite or something like this, without of course any progress in the vicinity of this settlement. Now we're moving to Donetsk. After a very long operational pause in this area, the Russians have activated their activity in this area, and during the previous 24 hours we got a lot of updates, very interesting updates from this bridgehead, and some of them are very important and very interesting. And first of all, let's start with Avdiivka. The Russians started bombing and shelling this settlement massively. Today we got the video how the Russians continue attacking against the coal mine, a coal plant in this area, chemical plant in this area. We're using the guided bombs. As you can see, this is still a very powerful stronghold, and there are still a lot of things to do for the Russian aviation. But anyway, the Russians continue doing this because this is the area, a possible area of accumulation of Ukrainian forces before possible Ukrainian counterattacks, or if the Russians attacks, let's say, of sending reserves to the north or something like this. And today we got another video how the Russians continue bombing and shelling the block number 9 on the south west of Avdiivka. On this video, we see that as a result of another FAB attack, another building was ruined and basically destroyed. So this is the situation. The Ukrainians were using this building as a tow position, as the raiders, as this is a very big building, and from this area, the Ukrainians were able to see everything around this settlement. So anyway, until the Russians are able to destroy this building, there is no chances that they can enter the settlement, or they can enter, but with very heavy losses from their side. So some activation in the vicinity of Avdiivka, another attempts to suppress the Ukrainian forces, not to allow them to be flexible, mobile, and probably and possibly we're going to see another offensive operation from the Krasnogorovka Veselaya closer to the south in direction of residential area, or something like this. But the most important updates continue coming from Krasnogorovka, from this settlement. Today we have already discussed the situation with Russian counter-offensive operation. During the day we got more video confirmed events from that settlement, from this bridgehead, and everything started with the drones attacks against the Ukrainian fortifications along the railways. On this video, we see how the Russians discovered the Ukrainian positions, the trenches along the railways. There were Ukrainians, at least 4 soldiers, at least on this video we see. And after the Russians started bombing and shelling them, that was the, let's say, drone preparation. First to attack, to reduce the spirit and morale of the Ukrainian forces, and after that, we saw another video of Russian offensive operation using armored vehicles and tanks. Before that, I'll remind you that most of the tow positions, anti-tank positions, were suppressed by the Russians during the previous weeks. So basically the Russians were more or less secured, and as you can see, at least for now, yet we haven't received any video from the Ukrainian side, any confirmation that they managed to shut down the Russian tanks and so on. Probably some of the tanks were shut down, were damaged during that attack, but anyway, the Russians managed to capture this territory or to return this territory under their control. So as you can see, according to this information, the Russians have prepared and created a very powerful bridgehead on the south of Krasnogorovka, and later today we got another attack, another video confirmation how the Russians were storming that settlement. Basically, the Russians established control over the southern part of Krasnogorovka. And the main purpose, we discussed that, of course, to have a successful operation to capture Krasnogorovka, it's not enough to attack from the south. Of course, the Russians need also to continue their offensive operation in direction of the edge stronghold in the northeastern area. But anyway, we can split and I'll remind you that when talking about Krasnogorovka, there are a few important positions for the Ukrainian forces. The first one is the industrial area in the central part of Krasnogorovka, which the Ukrainians were using as an eye position, and from this area the Ukrainians could see and could attack the Russian tanks and Russian offensive forces using the anti-tank missiles, and also they can correct and navigate the Ukrainian artillery. That area during the previous weeks was suppressed by the Russian artillery and Russian drones attack. There were a lot of videos from that bridgehead. And this is the first area. When talking about the northern area, there is another important sector of Krasnogorovka, and we're talking about this residential area with the high buildings. And from this area, the Ukrainians controls the Russian movements in this direction, also can attack the Russians and so on. We haven't received any video confirmation of Russian progress, of Russian suppressing this territory or bombing this territory. So I assume that there is no problems with this area, and based on the fact that there are a lot of buildings, I don't think that the Russians will try to attack massively from the eastern direction to the west. So there are going to be no such attacks. The only thing they can do is to capture a few strongholds, and probably the Russians can establish fire control over these roads and just to get closer. But when talking about the southern area, the Russians do have operational square to continue advancing to the west in this direction, from, let's say, the recently captured positions on the railways, and of course from the coal mine, also in direction of the southern residential area. And basically, as a result of these offensive operations, the Russians do have possibilities and can establish control at least over part part of Krasnogorovka that located on the south below the railways. So basically this area can be captured by the Russians. Of course, this is not going to be an easy job, and the Russians will be under fire control from the Ukrainian positions in these two areas, like residential area and industrial area. But from this perspective, the Russians also are able to attack the Ukrainian positions. And of course, if the Russians can do this, the most important part, if they are able to capture the southern part of Krasnogorovka, is to develop for the Russians their offensive operation in Nivolskaya. And if Nivolskaya falls and the Russians can proceed their movements to the west, at least to this point, they will be able to cut the supply road that goes from the mainland to Krasnogorovka from the north. So I believe that we are going to see some activation in that settlement. The Russians have completed the Battle of Marinka. This settlement haven't been captured, of course, but it's highly unlikely that anybody can capture. This area is completely ruined and there is basically no place to hide. And there are no Ukrainians, I believe, as well. So basically the Russians have possibilities to use the forces that were storming Marinka in storming of Krasnogorovka. And basically this is exactly what the Russians are doing. The Russians reported that the main offensive operation was held by the 5th Motorized Brigade Oplot when talking about these recent clashes for the railways. So the Battle of Krasnogorovka is about to begin, and this is going to be another bloody clashes, and this settlement also will be, of course, reduced till ruins and will be erased from the map. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings on Donetsk front line and, let's say, in the vicinity of Avdiivka, Klishchiivka, Bakhmut, Seversk, the Ukrainians lost 230 soldiers, 7 armored vehicles and 6 artillery systems. Also, we got a lot of updates from the southern part of Marinka, where the Russians also continue their regrouping, and soon we are going to see more attempts from the Russian side to attack in direction of Ukrainian trenches. The Russians will try to restore control over the fortifications in this small area. Today the Russians have already published the videos how they were bombing and shelling the Ukrainian positions along these forest lines on the north of Novomikhailivka, on the north. And this is not the first video from this region. This is the very important area which Ukrainians use to redeploy their forces, reserves to the north, which fight and stands against the Russian positions in the south of Marinka. And if we will increase the number of updates, as I remember, from this bridgehead we have already at least yes, as you can see, the Russians have already bombing the northern these forest lines, this area, these fields. So currently the Russians are trying to suppress and to destroy the Ukrainians' supply roads that they use to send their forces to the main defense belt in this area, and I'm talking about this line. Basically, this is the main Ukrainian defense belt, and this is the main supply roads that Ukraine use for deploying their forces. If the Russians can cut this area, establish 100% fire artillery drone control, then there are going to be no problems for the Russians to develop their offensive operation to the south and to develop the Russian bridgehead in this area, let's say along these lines, and to capture this entire area. So, and this is probably the purpose of the Russians, and this operation we're going to see we will start seeing this operation from the beginning of the next week. Furthermore, we got another very interesting update. The Russians for the second time in a row used a new type of helicopter missiles, Ilmur, with the Mi-24 helicopter. This is the second video in a row. A few days ago we got almost the same update from the same direction, not like a week ago, but probably somewhere in the end of July. We got something like this. This one, there was the first attack of that type of missile. This is the missile that can be launched within a distance of 15 kilometers. So basically these helicopters are invisible for the Ukraine air defense. That was the first usage, and this is the second usage. Anyways, you can see the Russians are completely focused on Novomikhailivka, and the most important that the Ukrainians are not counterattacking. Yes, they tried to bomb, and during the previous weeks they bombed Stepova, Taramchuk, these southern fortifications, but I expect that the main strike are going to take place not from the south but from the north in direction of those trenches, because the Russians first of all needs, as usual, to establish some fire control over the roads that goes to this settlement. Anyway, this is another battle of Donetsk that we're going to see within the next probably few days, because the Russians have improved their positions and they have everything necessary to complete the encirclement of that settlement. When talking about Remivka, we haven't received nothing from this bridgehead. There were no attempts from the Ukrainian side to attack, and that's mean that basically as a result of fierce fightings on the South Donetsk area, the Ukrainians lost 210 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles, and 2 artillery systems. This is about South Donetsk, and this area includes the settlement from Novomikhailivka to the Vremivka tactical bridgehead, including Ugledar. We got a lot of videos from the Russian side, how they were bombing and counterattacking the Ukrainian positions, but we haven't received any updates about any progress from the Ukrainian side. Now we're moving to the Vremivka, to the Orekhov Square, Orekhov Bridgehead, or the Bradley Square. Today the Russians reported somewhere at 4 p.m. of the local time, the Ukrainians launched another massive offensive operation in the direction of Robotina. That attack was repelled, and there was the clashes, the fightings in this area took place around 2-3 hours, and somewhere at 6 p.m. of the local time the Russians start reporting the first results. As a result of defense operation, the Russians managed to destroy at least 2 personal armored carriers of Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians managed to land their troopers, and currently there are clearing operation and clashes along the forest lines and so on. So basically, probably the Ukrainians were trying to make some rotation and send more fresh forces to the trenches and to the forest lines, and to replace the soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers that the Ukrainians lost during the previous days of clashes on this bridgehead. That wasn't like a real offensive operation, massive, with the hundreds of tanks and so on. More and more updates are coming from the Dnipro River. The Russians continue bombing and shelling the Ukrainian positions along the Dnipros, along the banks of the river, which confirms the Ukrainian positions at some points. And the thing is, when talking about Dnipro, is that the number of Ukrainian forces that the Ukrainians managed to stretch among the islands is unknown. We can't say whether there are like 1,000 soldiers or 100,000 soldiers. Of course, I don't think that there are 100,000 soldiers, but I believe that maybe among these Dnipro islands, the Ukrainians managed to stretch around 10-15,000 soldiers on the boats. And so that's meant that a massive army of Ukrainians, and the Russians currently don't know. They just can see and discover and track the Ukrainians' redeployment, their movements. And for example, and they can bomb the Ukrainians trying to reduce their possibilities. But we see that the Ukrainians also have already completed the preparation of Operation Day D, which means that they will cross Dnipro River and they will try to attack, and they will try to establish control over the Russian bank of Dnipro River. So, and this operation, more and more military experts and Ukrainian sources confirmed that this operation is going to take place very soon, in August, not in September, because in September the weather is going to be autumn, of course, and it will be very difficult to implement such operation. But in August, while the weather is normal, the Ukrainians still can cross the river and to attack the Russian positions. And probably that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.